Okay, good morning. I'm Pete Daly, CEO of the U.S. Naval Institute. Welcome to our panel today, which includes several of our numbered fleet commanders. Also on the Coast Guard side, we have Coast Guard PAC. We have the SEALs represented, and we also have several. We have several points of view to bring to you this morning on the idea of how we're doing in the gray zone, the area between war and peace. We're very fortunate to have our moderator today, Dr. Kathleen Hicks. Dr. Hicks is a senior vice president. She's the Henry A. Kissinger Chair. She's the director of international security programs at the Center for Strategic International Studies. She's a frequent writer and lecturer on U.S. foreign policy, national security strategy, budget and forces, and strategic futures. Dr. Hicks previously served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy with responsibility for assisting in development and oversight of global and regional defense policy, strategy, and operations. She also served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces, and she led the development of the 2010 Defense Strategic Guidance and the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review. She holds a PhD in political science from MIT, an MPA from the University of Maryland, and an AB from Mount Holyoke College. We're very pleased. Join me in welcoming Kathleen Hicks.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Pete and to the Naval Institute. I'm very happy to be off the East Coast today and here in San Diego. And I wanted to just take a few minutes to introduce the topic before we turn to the wonderful panel that we have here today. I think to many, the title of this probably sounds more than a little murky. The term gray zone, obviously, or gray area, as they're used rather interchangeably, invite ambiguity for many. But it's a commonly used term today. It's not the only one used, but commonly used to describe the range of threats the United States is facing that are falling below the threshold of conventional state-based military power, but are nevertheless threatening our interests. The Trump administration recently released a national security strategy and then a national defense strategy, and both speak directly to this idea of an increased range of competition with major adversaries or potential adversaries. So whatever we call this, and I suggest we don't expend too much energy on the debate on definitions, this phenomenon of adversaries attempting to achieve gains without direct confrontation is here, and it's also as old as warfare itself. The Cold War, for instance, clearly included a significant amount of such competition aimed at avoiding direct confrontation. But as power is diffusing in the world, and in particular as key states are rejecting the international status quo, this gray area, gray zone, is now one with increased risk, particularly with regard to the potential it creates for miscalculation about interests, will, and capabilities of each side. Examples certainly abound of where international rules of conduct and stability are being actively tested. This includes Chinese island building with concomitant emplacement of military capabilities on these land features, coercive tactics in the South and East China Sea, Russia's subversion and its self-proclaimed near abroad, and more broadly within Europe and the United States, and Iranian asymmetric tactics, especially through proxies, but also to include the capture and temporary detention of U.S. military personnel and the ever-present threat of maritime harassment in the Arabian Gulf. In the newer domains of competition, such as cyber and space operations, escalation ladders and legal frameworks are not yet well established, creating perhaps the greatest chance for miscalculation. What I hope to do on this panel today is talk to these wonderful experts that we have assembled to probe the aspects of gray area competition that are particularly relevant to the maritime community. I'm going to introduce everyone and then begin with a question. To my immediate left, I have Vice Admiral John Alexander, Commander of 3rd Fleet, who is well familiar with the challenges in particular that the Chinese are presenting. We also have Vice Admiral Mike Gilday, Commander of U.S. Fleet Cyber Command and Commander of 10th Fleet. Vice Admiral Fred Midgett, who's Commander of the Pacific Area Commander for Coast Guard Defense Force West. Rear Admiral Tim Szymanski, I'm so sorry, Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, And as I mentioned, Honorable Nina Jian, the former ambassador to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and currently the Deputy Mayor for International Affairs for the City of Los Angeles. Ambassador, we're going to begin with you to sort of take us back to where we're supposed to begin our foreign policy, which is at diplomacy. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'll ask the same question down the line, do we face these so-called, is this a thing? Do we face these so-called gray area challenges? And if so, what is it the United States can be doing to better meet them?
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here among this really distinguished panel. I worked closely with Admiral Harry Harris and his team at PACOM when I was ambassador, which was a terrific cooperation. Yeah, I do think we absolutely face these scenarios, and I think what I want to bring to this is how important diplomacy is in gray zone situations. I mean, to me, this is very intuitive, but it may not be intuitive to everybody, so I thought I'd just offer a few reasons why I think we really need our diplomats out there. So first, we need them to convince other countries in the region of what's actually going on. We have the ability to see and understand many times better than others, and so if we want to call out Russia's little green men or cyber attacks or whatever, we have to be able to respond, and we need other countries so that we can respond with them in non-kinetic ways, such as sanctions, which we imposed on Russia, which have had a very significant effect on that country. A second reason is to warn our friends. I mean, the Russian cyber attacks were part of this large effort across Europe, and we could now be banding with our European colleagues and confronting Russia. A third reason is that sometimes diplomats can help the activity to stop before it goes further. So Chinese cyber attacks against our business interests slowed down measurably and considerably when the diplomatic and intelligence and defense all worked together to craft a message that President Obama could give to Xi Jinping. And last, and in some ways more important, is a little bit more amorphous, but we want other countries in the neighborhood to be interpreting the gray zone conflict the way we are. We want to be able to maintain the moral high ground and explain that we are doing this for reasons that benefit everybody and that we are on their side. We want our actions to be looked at as legitimate. So, and in that way, they will give us many advantages, both large and small, in the commercial sector and the political sector. So you need diplomacy to frame the narrative, so to speak. So in the South China Sea, for example, we conducted regular freedom of navigation operations. And we diplomats explained that these were to maintain everybody's rights that are guaranteed under the UN Law of the Sea Convention for freedom of navigation and oversight. China, however, said that we were a outside, unreliable, dangerous, meddlesome partner that was, just stirring up trouble in a region where we didn't belong to begin with. And this is, a conversation that continues to be ongoing in the region. But we want to, maintain as favorable an environment as we can, and so we need our diplomats out there carrying our message. But the bad news is that our diplomatic resources are being completely decimated at this moment. The most senior career diplomat left at the State Department, Tom Shannon, announced that he was stepping down last week. And with his departure, 7 out of the 9 top leadership positions at State will be vacant. Several vital ambassadorships, including to South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, are vacant. And 60% of State's career ambassadors have left in the last year. So these are the most seasoned professionals that we have that go from region to region and are able to tackle the thorniest problems, and they're simply gone. The application rates to become a Foreign Service officer are also down really significantly. So we actually the diplomatic corps needs the support of our military and defense brothers and sisters to rally to our cause and to help us advocate for these kinds of resources, which are incredibly cost efficient compared to this world. So I'll end with that. I'll end actually with a quote from Secretary Mattis back in 2013. He said, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I ultimately need to buy more ammunition. I think it's a cost-benefit ratio. The more we put into the State Department's diplomacy, the less we have to put into a military budget."
Great, thank you. And we will return to some of those themes as we go forward. I think now I'll just go ahead next to Vice Admiral Alexander to give his thoughts on gray zones. What do they really mean? What are we facing? And what do we need to do about them?
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I have some notes here. I'm not going to read them, but I'd like to go through some points and just kind of cover the gray zone. So, gray zone is not a new concept. You know, it's an asymmetric form of warfare. Navy's no stranger to this. We've been doing asymmetric warfare on land for the last 2.5 decades. We've been operating in the gray zone. I've done 2 deployments in the Arabian Gulf as CO of Abraham Lincoln, 8 transits through the Straits of Hormuz. You know, there's people trying to move around you and do things that may or may not be trying to hurt you. Okay, so that gets to the point is what is the gray zone? So you know, I kind of view it as non-state actors executing state security objectives and utilizing the ambiguity that they have to make it hard to respond. Let me get this closer here. Thanks. So the big question then becomes, how do I identify these guys? Who are they? How do I prioritize them? And then what is my mission? What does the country want me to go do with my military might? And what is my ROE to conduct that? Okay? You know, without a clearly identified mission, clearly articulated and supporting ROE, it's difficult to come up with an acceptable course of action, and it's difficult to determine who the bad guy is, really. You know, there's a number of articles that talk about the gray zone. I read through a bunch of them before in preparation for the panel. They always have some sort of a vignette or scenario, and it's very clear in the vignette or scenario, you know who's who in the zoo. That's not the case. There's a lot of fog. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of unknowns. So without a defined mission and a defined set of ROE and a defined adversary, it makes it very difficult to act in that stage. So Third Fleet. Fleets in general have 3 main missions: prepare forces to go forward, provide forces forward, employ forces forward. So one of our primary missions at Third Fleet is to train maritime forces for the high-end fight. Okay, that's what I owe this country against a peer adversary. We do that against a peer adversary and developing threats. Okay, so we have created these series of warfare development commands. We've got Nautic in Fallon, Swittick here. IWDC just started up. So those commands are supposed to be conducting developing threats or coming up with TTPs and ways to go against developing threats. So when we train to the high end, we train them with a series of skills that once they deploy, they must be able to draw on those experiences, whether that's a high-end fight or whether that's a gray zone fight. Again, I go back to, what's the mission? What do you want me to do? What's my ROE? At that point, then I can provide you, I think, what you're looking for. So how do we get at this from regular day to day? So we have operations and exercises with our allies, partners, friends, okay? So those are important in getting at the ambiguous piece of who's operating in the AOR. It's like going, you know, I kind of equate it, you know, it's kind of like going to your in-laws in another state, you know? You love those guys and you kind of show up, but you don't know where the bad part of town is, you don't know where the tracks are, you don't know where to stay away, that sort of thing. So operating with your friends, partners, and allies helps you understand what their backyard looks like And most of the time, they can point over and say, you see that fishing fleet over there? They're not really a fishing fleet. They're collecting information. These guys over here, they are the fishing fleet. These guys over here, they're transnational crime. They're bad guys, So working with partners and allies in the region are key to getting at the ambiguous part of it. We are operating forward. So, you heard about Admiral Swift discuss the Third Fleet Forward concept. We've got Vincent is operating in the Sulu Sea right now. She's transiting. She's under OPCON, a Third Fleet. And we'll continue to work her with other partners in the region. She worked with Australia, Japan, South Korea last time. When I was CTF 70, I actually did a part of the deployment with a Japanese destroyer as part of my strike group. I did operations with the Philippines before we pulled into Manila. So those sorts of things building those relationships gets at the ambiguity areas of the conflict. Additionally, we participate in joint combined operations to specifically in the federal states of Micronesia. So Fred's guys, law enforcement boarding parties will go aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer and operate within the Oceania Islands and do what's called Oceania Maritime Security Initiative. And basically it's to help the federal states of Micronesia protect their EEZ and their fishing rights, okay? So that's a form of gray zone work that helps protect an ally and helps understand where the bad guys are in the area. So let's get to the heart of the question. So the heart of the question is, what are we doing about it? So we currently have patrol craft, Typhoon patrol craft. They operate out of Bahrain. They operate some out of Mayport. You see some of them in the Southcom area, that sort of thing. That craft will actually decommission, I think, 2024, 2025 time frame, inside the next decade. But we're fielding some pretty good stuff. We got a Mark 6 patrol boat that's coming online. It's a patrol craft that it's not a patrol craft like a Typhoon class. It's a little smaller than that, but it's a nearshore inland patrol craft, and it's very high end. I actually got to drive one here about a month ago. Thing operated. I had it up at 47 knots, and I was able to drive it with very little training with a guy looking over my shoulder. It's got good armament. It's got the ability to get it to gray zone fight. We're also fielding the littoral combat ship. So you got the Mark 6 near shore, inshore, to some area out. You got the LCS, very shallow draft, very quick, can operate in the littorals. Have mission packages for ASUW, ASW, mining, whichever, not all at the same time. They'll all be missionized. But you'll be able to use that in a gray zone type fight as well. Helicopter capability, small crew, a good comm suite, that sort of thing. And in addition, I talked about the Warfare Development Command. So SMWDC, it's the Surface Mine Warfare Development Command, run by Rear Admiral John Wade. They will be the ones that will get at the TTPs necessary to operate in the gray zone. And they will get at the TTPs that we will need to develop as these crafts come online and become usable, and we see maybe strengths, maybe weaknesses, maybe we see an evolving threat that we need to train against. Moreover, I think you'll see in the future a marked increase in virtual training environment. Okay, you put a small crew in a virtual training environment, you give them some ambiguity and let them work through the problem. I think you'll see that improve our gray zone tactics. So, bottom line, Navy is organized, trained to conduct a high-end fight. Those skills are transferable to the gray zone fight, I will tell you. Those forces are effective across a large range of spectrum of operations. We're fielding new vessels, Mark 6, LCS, even though we'll be decommissioning the patrol craft here in the next decade. We've got a Warfare Development Command that is that is key to developing tactics, techniques, and procedures as the new crafts come online. But I get back to the same eternal question to the gray zone, okay? How do I identify them? Who the bad guy is? What's my mission? What's my ROE to complete that mission? Thanks.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral Gilday, maybe you could bring the cyber element in particular into this discussion.
Sure. Is my mic on? Yep. Good morning. I'd like to begin with partnerships because that's where I'm going to end my remarks. And so in the room today, Admiral Lunday on this side. Admiral Lunday is the commander of Coast Guard Cyber. He also works for Admiral Rogers under U.S. Cyber Command. Kevin is a close partner with us, with the Navy in terms of defensive cyber, and also probably are fundamentally best tied to the Department of Homeland Security. I'd also like to point out Admiral Sharp, who is working the intel support, the cyber piece. Admiral Sharp will be talking about that during this conference. Admiral Kohler, who is our commander of Navy Information Forces. Yesterday he talked about the challenges of training or maintaining readiness across an enterprise in a very high-tech changing environment. Admiral Barrett, who's our resource sponsor and buys a lot of our stuff. Admiral Barrett, thank you. We have some allies and partners on this side who we exercise, train, and fight with, and I want to recognize you all as well. And then finally, all of you from industry, you're a key partner in this gray zone piece. And so I'd like to acknowledge you as well. 10th Fleet. So Fleet Cyber Command is the S2 headquarters. 10th Fleet is a tactical arm through which we fight. We have 3 missions. The first is tactical signals intelligence. So we're taking data that's collected, we're taking electronic data that's collected from foreign target systems. We're turning that into indications and warning that we push out to the tactical edge. We also provide global joint communications to the joint force, both voice and IP. Our mission to operate and defend networks falls under that pillar, as well as operating Navy satellites. The third mission set is offensive cyber. And so that's delivering effects in and through cyberspace. Those are not service-retained teams, but they are joint elements that work under Admiral Rogers as U.S. Cyber Command, and they support the combatant commanders. So just up front, kind of what we do, those 3 mission sets, SIGINT, defensive cyber, offensive cyber, network operations, they're separate and distinct, but they're also very much overlapping. The gray zone. So as I look in the gray zone, and we are engaged in the gray zone in cyber every day, I think about the fact that you see these instruments of power, and they're not just national instruments of power. They spread to proxies and other malicious actors that try and circumvent typical military head-to-head conflict, right, or confrontation. And they work in the world of ambiguity. They try to avoid confrontation in a way that they still achieve their strategic goals, but at the same time, they don't want to expose themselves to risk, and they also don't want to, they want to avoid any kind of severe retribution. Malicious activity in cyberspace is a really good, tangible example of what's going on in the gray zone. And so it really is what I would characterize as calculated ambiguity. Most of the operations that go on go across a number of different sectors. And so we just can't be concerned with protecting and examining what's going on against .mil or what's going on in the .mil domain. It's the commercial sector, it's academic institutions, it's government agencies, it's private citizens, and of course it's military networks. And so many of the operations that occur across that space, they're covert, they're unacknowledged, and they're shrouded in deception and denial. A few trends that I think play right into the gray zone that empower these actors. The first is, I would say, what we continue to see is a precipitous rise in cyber actors. And I would characterize some of them as criminals, actually a lot of them as criminals, some of them as state actors, and others as proxies that actually work for the state. And so that last group is an interesting group. So the proxies, and you've heard the Russian groups referred to as Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, they're tied directly to the GRU and the FSB. So they're doing their work for the state. At the same time, they're moonlighting at night and they're doing criminal activity. The same thing with DPRK actors are not only pursuing strategic goals, but they're also financing the state through criminal cyber activity. I would characterize some of the same types of behavior we see from Chinese cyber actors that are in uniform. They moonlight as well as Iranian actors. And so it's not just .mil. This is a pretty broad target space that we have to be aware of and involved in on a daily basis. Capabilities. And so there is a precipitous rise in capabilities available to cyber actors. Malware is cheap. It's bountifully available. You can actually purchase malware as a service. So if you want to buy an attack, you can buy an attack. In fact, on the dark web, they rate those providers of those attacks, 1 star to 5 stars. So you can go with the service you want. You can read their reviews, and you can actually buy a malicious attack, which of course makes attribution much more difficult for us. To tie that back to intent of a state actor. It gets back to this activity that is tied to strategic goals, to nation states, and their ability to act in a domain that lacks international norms, which makes deterrence confounding, because one person's acceptable behavior is unacceptable to others. And so that lack of international norms really hinders us, I think, in terms of getting our arms around or holding people accountable in the gray zone in cyberspace. I'd also say that there are trends in the tech sector right now. They're all meant for goodness that also fuel badness or fuel bad behavior. So the increase in connectivity, the Internet of Things, I spoke to the fact that private citizens and commercial sector are part of this target space in the gray zone. The increase in computing power, primarily the cloud technologies. The increase in automation, the trending towards AI, right? And so that's also being used in a malicious way and kind of pray and spray attacks that we see from some proxies of some state actors. So with that activity that I just kind of described and the challenge that we have in terms of getting our arms around it, what to do. And so as Admiral Alexander pointed out, first and foremost, there are big policy considerations that the United States has to wrestle with in terms of how we're going to act in the cyberspace domain. Whether or not we are going to essentially fight cyber v. cyber and reduce and lower ourselves to the same standards of behavior that we see from others, that in many cases we're saying are unacceptable. It's a bit of a conundrum. But there are policy considerations there that will drive missions and that will drive the authorities that oversee those missions. The second thing I'll point out is that information sharing is critical, but I don't think it's good enough. I think that the way that we're organized in the United States government for national security is grounded on the National Security Act of 1947. It was a different threat then. It was a different lens. But that's what we have. Of course, the intel community went through some changes after 9/11. DHS stood up. There have been some changes to that in terms of how we're organized. But when it comes down to what can we do better than we're doing right now, it comes down to seating people across a range of agencies and organizations, everything from DHS to DOJ to the intel community to the State Department to the Commerce Department to the Department of Defense to allies and partners to industry. How do you create an organization that acts in a way like, let's say, Jian of South and Key West, where you blend together multiple authorities from multiple agencies to go after a common problem set? Or if you take a look at what we're doing in space right now at Schriever Air Force Base, we're creating the National Space Defense Center that brings together Title 10 under STRATCOM and Title 50 NRO, NSA, putting them side by side to fight the war in space. We're going to have to think about how we fundamentally reorganize under the structure that we have to be much more effective. On the defensive side, it's clear that we have to. The defend the nation pace can't just be DHS. It can't just be DOD. And I would tell you that the virtual connections aren't good enough. You have to be sitting next to each other to do this right. So I just offer that as things to think about in the discussion. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. Thanks, Doctor.
Great, thank you very much. Admiral Midget, from your perspective, maybe Coast Guard, bring in the degree to which this is sort of in the zone you live in every day.
Yep, thanks, Dr. Hicks. Thanks to AFCEA, thanks to West and to the Naval Institute for including the Coast Guard on this panel. I'm pretty jazzed about this topic, actually. This is where the Coast Guard operates every single day. And in fact, that's why your Coast Guard was created. It was created because of smuggling in the very earliest days of our nation. Not necessarily a military threat, but a threat to the nation, a threat to our economic health. So when I look at gray zone activities, to be sure, war and peace, that gray zone between them, absolutely an issue. But for me, I see gray zones within gray zones. So not just war and peace, but also legal and illegal, and also state actors and non-state actors. And so I think that part of the response to that you've seen across the world is a rise of Coast Guards, because I tell people in my own service often that we are in an era of Coast Guards now, where they're rising, and it's just because of those very mission sets that touch on things that are gray, like migration and fisheries protection and protection of your own borders, all of those kind of things. If I look at, for example, if I look at China and I look at the blend between the PLA Navy and the China Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia, that's no accident. It's very purposely done, and the purpose is to remain gray, so that you can't quite figure out, well, at least you can't figure out from a law-based response exactly how to respond. So that's one part that's in my AOR, because the Chinese are heavily involved in fisheries. And we talked about, Sarge talked about Oceania, where we've got Coast Guard law enforcement detachments on naval ships. I would offer to you that it's more than just about fisheries. It is absolutely about fisheries, but it's also about relationships, and it's about staying connected to those countries. If you look at first island chain, second island chain, those countries will be important to us. And that relationship that we develop with them is very important. For many of those folks, their primary source of income is coming out of their EEZ. So when somebody comes in there and violates the norms, the standards, the rules of law, that's a national security issue for them. It's a regional security issue for them. Eventually, it's an economic security issue for them. If I look at North Korea and look at what they're doing, they're clearly operating in violation of the UN Security Council resolution about moving goods and services into their country. So there's a response to that can happen. You can track folks like that. You can board them. There's also a regulatory response about reaching out to who is trading with North Korea, and what's the repercussion that happens to those countries. If I look in the Eastern Pacific right now with counter-drug issues, there are transnational criminal organizations that come in, illegal non-state actors, and everything that money touches, it destroys and corrupts. Every single thing it touches. Governments, if you wonder why, I would suggest, if you wonder why there's 60,000 miners on the southwest border of the United States, I would tell you that many of those countries have become difficult to govern and violent. And people are leaving them for lots of reasons, but that's certainly a reason. So I told you, every single day we work in there. The Coast Guard has really a three-legged stool of authorities, which I think is important to how we get to business. One of it is that we have military authority, Title 10 authority. The other is we have Title 14 law enforcement authority, and the other is that we're a regulatory agency. And when I said that, I thought there was an era of Coast Guards coming. Partly is that you get all of those pieces. Not all of the world's Coast Guards look exactly like ours or developed like ours, but many of them are. And so there's a little bit of a gray zone response back when a Coast Guard cutter pulls up and carries out an action. And folks scratch their head a little bit. Is that the military, or is that the cops, or is that some regulator? And the answer is yes. And we can seamlessly move across that entire continuum depending on what we need. That's why we ride on Navy ships and we work for Navy COCOMs under a Title 10 authority. And then when it shifts into a law enforcement action, turn the hat around, shift our flag to a Title 10 or a Title 14 Coast Guard officer, and carry out the law enforcement piece of it. I think that's the special sauce that makes the Coast Guard work. If I was looking at the response to this, I would say a couple of things. And just a couple. There's more, but I'll leave it at two. But if you want to counter this, I'd say the first thing is people need to be aware, and they need to be on the same page. And that means, we have great a maritime domain awareness as a nation, but there are other nations that do as well, and we have some issues with sharing information. And I think we need to work through those and probably be a little better about sharing information with folks that are not just Five Eyes, not just our natural allies, other folks that are friendly to us or have the same objective that we do. So that's number one, I'd say, is awareness. The second is I think the home team is going to have to play team ball. And we're not bad at it. We're pretty good at it. But this net is not completely knitted together as tight as it could be. And so I know that the cliche of whole of government and using all the elements of DIME, it's absolutely true. Every single part of our government needs to be focused on this if you want to be competitive in the gray zone area. And there are things like MOTOR, the Maritime Operational Threat Response, that's set up specifically to take all of the different parts of government. And when there's a maritime incident, have every agency have an opportunity to say, what's the objective of the United States for this event? Sometimes you might roll into it thinking it's a military objective, or sometimes you think it's an immigration objective, and you find out those are not the pieces that we're most interested in as a government. We're going to do X. So I would say we need to understand each other's authorities and make sure that we are working together as a team. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Admiral Szymanowski, if you can close us out maybe with also, you live in a world that is entirely consumed with the gray zone, so I'm sure you bring a lot of history to this as well.
Dr. Hicks, thank you. So the gray zone, we've heard the word ambiguity a few times today and describing the gray zone. It's kind of like my last name.
I know,
full of
I
ambiguity.
apologize.
But you are much braver than Pete Daly for attempting my name. So the gray zone, I think we need great power. But I'm not as honored to be here as the rest of the panelists because I thought I'd be in Philadelphia at the parade this morning with my folder here. But this is a good second best. One of the articles I did researched for in preparation for the topic of this panel, dominating in the gray zone between peace and war, is captured really well by Hal Brands, senior fellow in the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. It's a really good article. It's a quick read, but really well researched about the discussion. Let's not describe, to try to define the gray zone here this morning. But one of those quotes in there is that America is not poorly equipped, but may not be fully prepared. And I think the release of the National Military Strategy and the National Defense Strategy is actually absolutely, I'll call it brilliant, the clarity that the SecDef has communicated, because it's about preparation. And I think what's laid out in the NDS about lethality, building a more lethal force, ensuring partners, many things you just heard by my colleagues up here this morning, and also DoD reform for speed of relevancy. And all those things we talked about, shared authorities, and that's what I talk about when we say great power. Because I think the world's changing at an accelerated pace, and I know that was a part of the topics yesterday about gaining time, and I'm going to save that for last. So that's my first point about the National Defense Strategy and being prepared for the gray zone. Also, well kind of articulated in the strategic environment of the National Defense Strategy is the things that special warfare and SOF writ large have been involved in for the last 16, 17 years with the violent extremist organizations. And that's going to be a constant in the strategic environment. We know that. That's not a gray zone issue. But that is an issue that's going to have to be held in check. And it's pretty clear in the National Defense Strategy that the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. And so SOF is going to have a role in holding the VEO threat in check, in concert with law enforcement, our intelligence community, and our foreign partners. So that's my second point. I think the third piece is SOF definitely has a definitive role. And Dr. Hicks, you started with a historical perspective about the Cold War. The reality is, SOF was expanded under President Kennedy in 1962 just based on what would then now we call the gray zone for checking threats in that ambiguous nature of war. But SOF has that definitive role, both from a legacy point, as well as I think we've conditioned not only the enemy and our adversaries and our peers, our near peers out there, but we also conditioned our own selves of what SOF has been doing for the last 16 or 17 years. And I think there's a re-education piece to what SOF can provide in the gray zone in the way of illumination and maybe piercing through some of that ambiguity in response that's below the threshold of conflict with potentially less risk, as well, and to be so bold as even to assert our will in that zone. And so a lot of what I've been doing over my time in command is really trying to kind of reestablish, particularly for the near-peer adversary piece, is a return to interoperability with the Navy, because as well as the Marine Corps and as well as the other partners, because it's going to be important. We're going to rely on that support in the gray zone fight. And then the fourth point, and I only have two more, is that this will require the traditional interagency cooperation, again, that all of my colleagues have already mentioned. But I would echo the ambassador's comments on the diplomacy, as well as the whole of what I call whole of international community effect. And I think that's what we tend to talk a lot about whole of government, but the whole of an international community approach is important. And so these regional alliances, traditional partners, non-traditional partners, traditional alliances, non-traditional alliances, you just look at some of the things, and there's some ambiguity in those right now in the things that we're doing in northeast Syria with non-traditional partners and other partners in Somalia and other places around the world where SOF's employed. So that the instruments of power, the military is just one small tool in the toolkit, and SOF is just one other tool as well. So what is NSW? My last point. What is NSW doing to dominate? Because that's the topic I think was of the panel, to dominate in the gray zone. As already determined, as already said up front, we're going to have to maintain that VEO check, that violent extremist organization check. But we're looking at through the view of the National Defense Strategy to be more lethal, to ensure partners and DoD reform. I'm looking at my design, my organizational design, and my structure hasn't changed much since the early 90s. And I think I can look at some reform in my own organizational design to be more lethal, be more modernized. And I won't get into all our capabilities, albeit I have some pretty unique surface and subsurface capabilities, as Sarge Alexander kind of mentioned in his update there. Second is really an innovative approach, and again, it was talked about yesterday, and the CNO and the Commandant speak to this all the time. The speed of decision, and the speed of decision is going to be, decision dominance is going to be where it's at. Admiral Gilday talked about the AI, so we're already exploring three areas that I'm really looking into that I think will help us. In the high velocity learning aspects that the CNO talks about, is the seeking to understand quicker and then being able to apply that in real time. Whether that's a kinetic kill chain or a non-kinetic kill chains, there's ways to speed that up. And AI, he who dominates in AI is going to dominate in the decision space. So we're looking pretty broadly in everything from target development to target execution through AI and machine learning. The second area where we're delving into quite deeply is augmented reality and virtual reality. A lot of times for our reps, what we can do at a lower risk for iterating on concepts from everything from our joint tactical air controllers through our undersea piece, we have some pretty unique simulation through the AR and VR, and I think that's part of that high velocity learning when we don't have to always be out kinetically training. And then the last thing is the aspect of the Internet of Things, and this kind of goes to the CNO's piece of the bigger fleet, the better fleet, and the networked fleet. The aspect of that, and another quote in the article by Howe is about not simply that the challenge of the gray zone is not simply a matter of resources. It's a matter of orienting ourselves organizationally and conceptually to meet the challenge. And I think it's a good kind of encapsulation of the challenge. But the reality is, as we talked about yesterday, gaining time. He who can gain time and get that decision dominance, I think, will be the victors in whether it's a gray zone fight or even a high-end fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for the audience, so I'm going to try to stick to just 2 questions up here. The first I'll ask Ambassador Hachichian, and then any others who on the panel are welcome to chime in after. And that is sort of returning to your point, Ambassador, on diplomacy and your particular experience maybe working with the ASEAN states. Here they're in a region where they have a large and militarily capable and economically powerful neighbor. What is it in your mind that is most assuring to them and has the most deterrent value, if you will, for China that the United States can bring in that region? What worked best in terms of assuring them that America would be with them in these gray zone challenges?
Well, I'd say there's a real spectrum of their approaches to China, but basically they all would like to have it both ways. They would like to maintain China as their strongest economic partner, and for most of them it is their strongest economic partner, at least when it comes to trade. And they want the protection of the United States, and they want the United States to be a strong economic partner as well, and Japan and Korea and others. So this is just talking about the 10 countries, smallish countries in Southeast Asia. So I think it's a few things. I think it is being honest and predictable and straightforward with them about what our interests were. Being consistent about being there and assuring them that we're going to continue to be a Pacific power, and bringing them information that they would not otherwise have, as others in the panel have alluded to, and I think bringing them together in some cases, giving them the understanding that if they together were to send a tough message to China, which they did at some points, even though they operate by consensus, and even though some of those countries are, heavily influenced by the Chinese, they were still able to deliver tough messages to Beijing that, to many from the outside looked like, kind of squishy diplomatic language, but were heard loud and clear in Beijing and drove the Chinese crazy. So to give them the appreciation that we would stand by them in those situations, and that others would as well. I should also say it was critical that we had like-minded partners that we worked with very closely, the Australians, the South Koreans, the Japanese, sometimes the Indians, and having those and New Zealand, having those close partners was also critical to operating well in this region. And I just want to say that the 2 themes that I heard among the admirals who spoke were, 1, how important it is to have friends and allies and partnerships, and 2, the importance of international norms. And I'd say that both of those areas where diplomacy can really, and diplomats in their day in, day out can really bring a lot of value. Because sometimes these relationships that we have with countries are complex, and their leadership changes, and their political systems are very different from ours in many cases. And so you need somebody who understands how messages diffuse and who's actually in charge to bring our messages to them in an effective way.
Great. Anyone else want to comment on the issue of allies and partners? Okay, and let me ask this question then, beginning with Admiral Alexander. Several of you, if not all of you, touched in some way on general themes of adaptability, adaptation, how we're shifting to be ready to meet these challenges among the others that we're looking to meet, and of course the ambiguity of this particular challenge set requiring a force that is able to adapt in real time as challenges present themselves. So starting with you, Admiral Alexander, can you just give me a sense of where you feel that we are adapting most quickly, in your case for the Navy, and where do you feel we're most challenged right now in our adaptation? And these can be training, workforce, capability sets, intel, et cetera.
Okay, so I think, so I'll go back to the comment that Tim made about the speed of decision. So when you hear the CNO talk, he talks about the OODA Loop. So observe, orient, decide, and act, okay? His point in that is we're getting to a point where everybody observes at about the same speed, okay? So you orient, the winner is going to be the guy that can orient, decide, and act faster than the other guy, okay? Now, if you take that a little bit further, kind of what Mike was talking about with artificial intelligence, and you apply big data to that, maybe the OODA Loop is not the OODA Loop anymore, okay? So think about car companies. They can tell you when your your fuel pump's going to go out the week prior because they have so much data, and they just tell you to come in and fix it. If we had enough big data and we had the right artificial intelligence, we could actually turn the OODA Loop into the PODA Loop. So at that point, you're not orienting anymore. You're actually predicting, okay? So the OODA Loop is not the observe, orient, decide, and act. It's the predict, orient, decide, and act because you have enough big data that's going through some artificial intelligence. And that prediction is based, if you have that prediction capability through a big data type artificial intelligence machine, you will better unveil the ambiguity that's associated in the gray zone and have an opportunity to maybe attribute that to state actors because, non-state actors, they circumvent diplomacy. That's their purpose, They're not attributable to anything. The states that they work for or may work for deny that they exist. If something goes wrong, they just throw their hands up and say they weren't ours or they were fishermen or they were this or that. So I think the next big step for us is to get into the big data, the artificial intelligence, and get in a more predictive role than an observer role.
Very helpful. Others?
Yeah,
Yeah, please.
I would just like to, if you're talking about challenges, when I think about gray zone behavior, one of the analogies I make in my mind is like a schoolyard bully who is really the ultimate gray zone non-state actor because the teachers never know that they're a bully. And the way they're successful is they pick off the weaker kids one at a time. What those kids are looking for is somebody to a hub to gather around. And I think that's a role that the United States fills as well. The ambassador said it much better than I did about being honest and predictable and straightforward and consistent in our messaging. But I think our messaging needs to be there. People are looking for somebody who's got a clear message, they understand what it is, and they will gather around that because there is strength in numbers. So when I look at challenges, back to your question though, challenges for me, I think the Coast Guard brings a lot to this issue. I look at a China Coast Guard that's going to approach 700 ships, and I'm not just talking about little patrol boat craft, I'm talking about ships that are 12,000 tons and pretty heavily armored that can go out and do some business, flight deck equipped ships for a country that has an EEZ 1/10 of the size of ours. So for me, my biggest problem is capacity. And we're talking about the buildup of the United States military, as we should. But I'll tell you, the Coast Guard's been left out of that conversation. And I think we need to be in that conversation at the highest levels because you can only have so many Coast Guard cutters that you can only be in one place at one time. And so that's my biggest challenge is capacity.
Go ahead.
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you talked about the adaptation, and I take it right back to the National Defense Strategy. The SecDef closed out in its conclusion about the urgent pace of change required at scale in his three areas of lethality. And that third one, this DoD reformation of process, is about the speed of relevancy. But I think the areas of adaptation that we're not really inclined to talk about our vulnerabilities, but the areas that particularly some of the global commons and the domains that we may not have accelerated fast enough, cyberspace and others, are I think where we have to put a lot of energy into how quickly we're going to adapt.
Okay, we have time now for questions. There are microphones set up. And I I see folks moving already, so I'll begin on the right to the first mover here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Doctor. Jim Patton, retired submariner. For anyone who feels they want to answer this, does it help or hurt the United States not to be a signatory to the UN Law of the Sea? And if it if it hurts us, what is your prediction to what we're going to do about it in the future to join?
I'd say, just from my perspective, it absolutely hurts us, because the first thing that China says when we say we're maintaining the UN Law of the Sea Convention is, but you're not even a signatory to the UN Law of the Sea Convention, so why do you can't even have this conversation with us. But the fact is we abide by it, even though we are not signatories. And so it is a definite it's a definite disadvantage to not just be signatories.
Do you want to give a sense of prediction? That was the second half of the question. Will the United States ever be a signatory?
I don't know. I doubt it. Anytime soon.
So let me jump into this fray. So we didn't ratify it, and we follow the rules. China signed the damn thing. They don't follow the rules. So who's more right in this argument, okay? There's a difference between an island, a rock, and a low tide elevation. Just because you pour a ton of sand on top of low tide elevation doesn't make it inhabitable. So following international norms is what we're about, okay? And we do that day in and day out. We do FONOPS, freedom of navigation. We don't do them just against the Chinese. We do them against everybody, okay? The whole idea is to enforce international norms. So whether it gets signed or not, we follow the rules. We follow the rules to the letter. They don't.
Very good. Okay, question right here.
Former Ambassador, Admirals, Doctor, my name is Lieutenant Thomas, cryptologist and Deputy Information Warfare Commander for Amphibious Squadron 5. My question is, what can we do as a nation, whether it be diplomatically or militarily, to counter or at least balance China's arguably near perceived free reign in gray space, anything from cyber I/O or public affairs? I know that Ambassador actually alluded this to as well. Is there anything that we can do more at this point?
Yeah, let me throw that open on strategic messaging, I/O, et cetera. Does anyone want to take a first stab at that? There you have. I think that answers your question. I mean, I'll jump in. I don't mind. I'm the moderator, but I'm happy to jump in. I think the United States has had a terrible time, particularly since the end of the Cold War and the disestablishment of the structure. I think Admiral Gilday rightly raised structural reform issues that the United States is facing. This is one of them. We've been quite bad at figuring out how to galvanize the incredible information tools that the United States could have within the norms of our democracy. Part of that's about the U.S. government organization, but a lot of it's about how the U.S. government could better leverage the tools that are out there in the private sector, its allies, et cetera, so that they're credible voices that are perceived to be credible coming to the table. We obviously learned this very clearly in the so-called war on terror, if you will, but our entire campaign set dealing with counterterrorism, we live that. We see that now very much from the Chinese, from the Russians and others and the Iranians, who are very effective, frankly, at strategic messaging, advantaged by having the type of regimes they have. But I don't think we should feel that we are at a disadvantage because we have a democratic system. I think we have a lot of tools that we're not leveraging. Okay? No one else? We'll go to the next one there, and then we'll go over to Sydney. Go ahead. You go ahead, and then we'll go to Sydney.
All right, kind of jumping in the line here, but that's awesome.
Sorry, I didn't know it.
Scott Kinner, Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group. So I would like to kind of challenge the panel to come back to a few things. Optimizing the force. That's when we understand optimizing the force. And what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 decades is that you can't optimize for everything. If you optimize from the high end, the force has demonstrated its inability to rapidly just take those skills and shift them to something else. Every time the force has had to been reinvented. The second part of that, of course, is that we understand our special operations community is being leaned on, correctly so, in many different ways, but it's stressing the quality and the size of that force. And you can only build that so big before you start losing that quality. It's a math issue. So to the panel, what are we going to optimize for? Because I would argue you can't optimize for everything. So if the gray zone's done right, the state actor never actually has to fire a shot, or by the time they do, you're no longer in a position to respond because they've taken your options off the table. So how are we optimizing the force? Are we going to optimize to the high end, or how are we going to break out a section that can actually act in the gray zone effectively? I
Got
don't
it.
think you can do both.
Okay, anyone want to take that on?
At least for me, I think you can. And so my argument isn't about changing the way that the force we have operates, except to operate jointly with other elements of the U.S. government. So on the defensive side, it's with DHS. If it's defend the nation, the Department of Defense has a role in defending the nation. And so how would we use our defensive forces to support DHS in any kind of massive attack on U.S. critical infrastructure? Right now we're siloed. That gap needs to be closed. And it's not just in a high-end fight. When you think about war fighting, right, and you think about, in cyberspace, at least for me, it extends, it's not just the, phase 2, phase 3 fight that we traditionally talk about. It's today. We're sub-optimized today because we're not working side by side, is my argument. Offensively, it's shared space between the intel community and Title 10. Why can't we do joint ops and carve up the space? And so it is contested, congested space out there in cyber. And my argument is, if you really want to be a more formidable adversary against nation states, particularly in the gray zone fight, then we've got to organize a bit differently than we're organized right now, both offensively and defensively.
Okay, go ahead, Sidney.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. I've followed Dr. Hicks all the way from Washington, but the restraining order keeps me back about here. Although stalking is kind of part of what the gray zone is about,
I don't like where this is going.
Yeah.
Let's move off the stalking analogy.
the cyber aspect we talked about, but there's also the electronic spectrum, the electronic warfare aspect of it, which we often focus on the cyber without realizing half that goes over wireless. How are we seeing gray zone in the spectrum, be it electronic sensing or be it aircraft actually buzzing our ships? The Russians claim they shut down the Donald Cook's Aegis. That's almost certainly not true, but it shows the kind of things that people are at least thinking about in this area. I'm curious what of that you're experiencing and how you might be able to counter that.
Please.
So I can talk about this, or others that are welcome to chime in as well, but I agree with you that you can't just look at cyberspace. You also have to look at the convergence with space and the electromagnetic spectrum. It's a Venn diagram. They overlap. They're mutually supporting, okay? They're mutually supporting mission sets. We have an awful lot of capability in each of those three cylinders of excellence. It's bringing them together, and the first step is how we're organized at the fleet level. So if Admiral Davidson talks about fleet design, how we're empowering fleet commanders in their roles as Joint Force Maritime Component commanders to own and fight the battle space that they're responsible for. Part of that is owning is owning the C2. It's owning the awareness inside that virtual battle space. Part of that's reorganizing those staffs themselves. What we've seen as a microcosm of that is that our carrier strike groups and our ARGs, we now have an information warfare commander where we've combined the 2, the 3, 9, the 6 on a strike group staff to do that stuff. That will naturally occur at the fleet level, at the fleet staff level, to do the exact type of work that you're talking about. And then this lends itself as well to new technologies, right? AI in particular, looking across that virtual space.
Great. Go ahead. Last question.
Good morning, David Boehm, a career diplomat, just left state after 30-odd years. Yeah. That said, some of Admiral Alexander's comments earlier on what's your mission and being given something that's achievable against an adversary who's got obvious or implicit interests in not playing by the rules. In fact, we'll undermine the international order any way we can. And Ambassador, I promise I'm not trying to bring up bad memories of code of conduct discussions or anything like that, but I do wonder what more does the panel think is needed in terms of defining U.S. goals in the international order at a more specific level that's actually got operational effect? And to be fair to everyone else in this audience, what other things could industry and outside experts be providing that helps you get to more of that identification and response scenario of not necessarily non-state actors, but blurry state actors?
Ambassador, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'll just make one comment, which is, so China and Russia, I think, are somewhat different in how we treat them. China really does not want to be isolated. It does not want to be called out as someone who's not following the rules. And so to the degree that we can ourselves follow them, which I know that we do, and stand up for them, then that then puts them in a place they don't want to be, and they will adjust their behavior accordingly to some degree. But that involves a large diplomatic effort with everybody on our side, and it's difficult to achieve. Another difficulty, going to an earlier question about China, is just we have such a complex relationship with that country, and so trying to get the entire government onto the same page about what to do moving forward is always a challenge. Because we have, we've got to work with them on climate change if we really want to, reduce climate change. We have to work with them on North Korea. We have massive economic interdependence. So getting everybody together is always a challenge.
Others? Okay. And I have a question right here. I don't know if you can get to a microphone, sir. But you can ask and I'll repeat it. Yeah, please. Go ahead, please. Yes. Okay, so the question to the panel is, shouldn't we look for strength in numbers by looking for something like a Southeast Asian NATO or some kind of an alliance arrangement nation? I'm sorry, Ambassador, I think it's right back to you on that.
Well, I'd say two things about that. I mean, ASEAN itself, which we're not a member of, has pledged to not resolve any of their differences through military force. And they've managed to keep that promise for 50 years and integrate somewhat economically. But they don't see so much eye to eye that they will operate together, at least not in most situations. And as I said earlier, they really want it both ways. If they joined, some kind of actual military alliance with us, they know that China would just not have that. It would not be an option. And so they have to live right there. So they are, trying to preserve all their options, and they are very economically 2-to-1 dependent on China. So I think it would be difficult to execute.
Well, it's difficult to execute too. I mean, they were, correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador, but they were created as an economic group.
Yeah.
But, in the South China Sea, there's a bunch of, it's not just the Chinese, there's a bunch of other nations that claim rocks and islands from other nations. So it's kind of hard to get together as a group if you don't agree who all owns what down there,
Well,
Okay.
I would say, though, that there are other forums that are kind of like that. There's an Arctic Coast Guard forum right now that involves all the Arctic nations, and that includes Russia that's in there, and Canada and Finland and Iceland, Denmark, all the others. There's a North Pacific Coast Guard forum that has the United States and Canada, Japan, South Korea, and China. Folks that normally don't talk to each other, and Russia. Folks that normally don't talk to each other, but have come together on something that we can't agree about, and it tends to de-escalate things. So maybe there are subgroups kind of like that, and I talked about the rise of the era of Coast Guards. I think that's certainly something that could, I had written down, I thought you were looking at my notes because I had written down to myself here, NATO for the Pacific, but maybe NATO-like, or maybe even NATO-light, but something that defuses tension instead of ratchets them up. And if we have time, can I follow up on one thing? And it was about UNCLOS, whether law of the sea, whether it's a positive or a negative. And I tell you, at least in one way that it's a negative is if you're not a member, you don't have a vote. You can talk to people, you can persuade people, but you don't vote. And voting is important in our world. So I just read the other day, China is not an Arctic nation, but they've declared themselves a near Arctic nation. And they're going to have a partnership with Russia up through the Arctic. Think about that. through the Northern Sea Route into a trade market into Europe. That's a big deal. I don't know how they're going to behave up there. I would certainly hope they want to follow the rules and standards and norms of international law.
And then Nina, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. Although a formal alliance is not possible, we should continue to do the lots of military cooperation that we're doing with those nations, and Coast Guard is absolutely critical there. But we, for example, had all the ministers of defense of all the 10 ASEAN countries to Honolulu when I was ambassador, and that kind of thing, where it's a 10 plus 1, so the 10 of them plus us, we should be doing lots of that and continue to. It's a really important part of our strategy there.
Okay, we have one final question from over here.
Thank you. Jonathan Kennan with the Marine Corps Cyber Operations Group. We talked about...
Can you get a little closer to the microphone?
I apologize.
No problem.
We talked about big data and using AI to strengthen our OODA Loop, and I love the Boyd reference. AI is as good as the data itself. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious as how are we going to protect the big data that's coming in as our inputs to support the AI initiatives?
Great question. Anyone?
So we've done a lot so far. We've hardened not all, but a great number of our PII repositories. When we talk about transition to the cloud, and it becomes a teamwork defensive effort with a vendor, right? That's still our PII. They're protecting it. We need visibility on it 24/7 on the health and welfare of that data that we own. We are spending a lot of time thinking about how that contract language is written, how those trust relationships are formed and executed, including incident response. So I would tell you that that data, what you're seeing right now, from hackers is you're seeing trust hacks, right? Whether it's the DNC, whether it's the WikiLeaks piece, people are going after data, and it's what our adversaries are going to go after in military networks. They don't have to smoke a server, right, to cause problems. All they need to do is cause distrust of the data that's going to drive command and control of the fleet or of a ground force or of an air force. And so trusted data is a big deal for us, and it's something that we invest an awful lot of resources in and energy in.
Great. Thank you very much to the panel today. We have Admiral Alexander, Admiral Gilday, Admiral Midget, Admiral Szymanski. I almost did it. You'll have to teach me afterwards so I do not mess this up again. And Ambassador Hichichian. Please, everyone, join me in thanking them for hopefully enlightening us a bit on the gray zone.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks, for the moderation of this panel, and thanks to Admirals Alexander, Gilday, Midget, Szymanski, and Ambassador Hichichian for all of the excellent discussion. I think this panel, we were a little out there with the topic. We wanted to explore something different. I got a lot out of it. This was excellent, and we thank you. Again, on behalf of Naval Institute and FCA, we want to present Great Powers, Grand Strategies, the New Game in the South China Sea, Naval Institute Press book by Anders Kaur with an FCA bookmark. We have one for each of you. Thank you again. Let's give one more hand to our panel.